Welcome to Gartner ThinkCast. I'm Karen Stokes-Lockhart. Today, we're exploring how organizations can understand and capitalize on the productivity gains of generative AI. Just over a month ago, we had Gartner Chief of Research Chris Howard touch on the roles of AI and productivity in a resilient organization, referencing further research from Gartner's Senior Director Analyst, Nate Suda. In this episode, you'll hear from Nate himself as he walks through a portion of his recent webinar entitled GenAI and Productivity, Where to Focus for Maximum Impact. Nate will touch on what we actually mean by productivity, why it's not the same as value, and how to account for leakage with every gain. Now, here's Nate.
Everyone is talking about generative AI these days. And most of the time when they talk about generative AI, they are also in the very same breath talking about productivity. And of course, now we are getting to the stage where organizations are looking for how to measure this, where to measure it, who is getting faster, who's getting slower, and where do we invest to get the biggest gains. And so we're going to be talking about all of those things. So first, before we get too far, we're just going to level set. What do we mean by productivity? Now, this is really important. This isn't just an academic exercise. It's really important that productivity, when we say that, we are all talking about the same thing. And this applies within your own organization as well. And the reason for this is because if we mean different things by productivity, we can be measuring different things. And if you measure the wrong thing, what could be a success could look like in the numbers a failure, or vice versa if we're measuring different things. And we'll talk about that as we go through. Then we're going to focus on who to focus on for maximum impact. What we have found is that different individuals within your organization respond differently to generative AI. And we're going to cover what that means and what that means for your productivity strategy. And then finally, that impacts organization and organizational change and what to prepare for and how to get the most out of your generative AI strategy, bearing in mind the organizational changes that are likely to occur. Okay, so let's get started. What do we mean by productivity? So there's a few concepts here that we'll cover. First is something that we call productivity leakage within Gartner. So let's say we have a working day and we implement generative AI and we create some new time. Now, this is just illustrative. This doesn't mean we're going to create something like 30, 40% new time, but it's just illustrative. We will create some new time. Now, let's say we've created some new time, but at the end of the day, I've created, say, 14 minutes. That number is significant, by the way. Let's say I've created 14 minutes at the end of the day, and I go and I get a cup of coffee, right? Where has my productivity gone? It's just disappeared. Sure, I'm doing my tasks faster, but if I have used that time with a cup of coffee, my net productivity increase is 0. Now, that's kind of a cute example, but there are others. For example, task switching. If I'm doing one task and then I go to another task, the time it takes to go to between those tasks is significant. In fact, there's some very interesting research that shows that that may be the greatest single task that many of us do in a working week. And so as we're increasing the volume of tasks, the task switching increases as well. Similarly, if we're increasing the volume or the variability of tasks, we need more coordination. We need more meetings. We need more management time. We need to coordinate those tasks. And that eats into our time as well. And then finally, there is the theory of constraints. And this is very significant for generative AI because normally, or most of the time, I should say, when we're looking at generative AI use cases, we're generally looking at them at a task level. And so let's say we have lots of tasks in a process, and we look at one task and we say generative AI can increase the productivity of that task significantly. Okay, fantastic. Why? Like the numbers stack up. Why wouldn't we do that? It sounds like a great business case. Well, if the next task or after that is a bottleneck, and it's already a bottleneck, if we've increased the productivity of this task here, we're not going to get anything more through that bottleneck because it's already a bottleneck. And indeed, the theory of constraints says that as we put more pressure on that bottleneck, as we try and put more work through it, it becomes more fragile and actually less work gets through the bottleneck, right? There's a greater risk of failure, a greater risk of rework. And so what this all means is that we've created some new time, but we haven't created as much time as we think we have, and that is productivity leakage. Now, let's say we have created that time, and let's call that time a productivity gain. Now, the language here is important, but just for the moment, let's call this a productivity gain. Now, I have a lot of CIOs who will say to me, Nate, I am increasing productivity. I'm driving value for my organization. And I say, well, no, you're not. And they look at me and they think, wait a minute, what is this? What productivity is good? I'm driving value. And I'll say, I'll completely agree that productivity is good, but productivity is not the same as value. Of course, value in most organizations is either cost reduction on the one hand, or capability or revenue growth on the other. And this applies to private as well as public organizations. In public organizations, it's more about capability growth or attainment of mission objectives. In private organizations, it is also about capability or revenue growth. But the point is that in most organizations, value is one of these two things, and productivity is neither of them. And so, while it's very, very important that we create the benefit of productivity, that benefit has to be converted into value. And that conversion is, you can call it conversion, or we often in Gartner refer to that as harvesting value, taking a benefit and then harvesting value from that. So it's important to recognize that these two things are different. And while number one has to come first chronologically, and then number two, strategically, number two has to happen first in your planning before you do number one. Why? Well, because number two, either cost reduction or capability growth, is your constraint. Like, there's a lot of ways in your organizations that you can increase productivity. There's a myriad number of ways you can do that for potentially every single employee. But not every employee can lead to cost reduction or capability or revenue growth or attainment of mission objectives. Another way of thinking about this is that in your organization right now, you probably have open requisitions for new hires. Now, that's great, but you probably don't have new hires or planned new hires for every single role in your organization. Why? Well, because you don't need, a second of every single role. Now, generative AI, what it promises to do is increase the productivity of potentially every employee, potentially equally or near to that. We'll talk about that in the second section. Now, generative AI is not going to increase the productivity by 100%. Of course, it's not going to create a second. But if you're not hiring for a second of every employee, then is there a need to increase the supply of your employees, or in other words, increase productivity, if there isn't demand for it? So what this means is that your cost reduction techniques or your capability growth, that is your constraint. And you need to plan for how you're going to convert or harvest that benefit of productivity into this value to actually impact your organization successfully. And that comes to the next point, where productivity isn't always about faster. Often when we talk about productivity, we talk about doing things faster. And that is sometimes true. Sometimes we can talk about productivity as increasing the speed of a worker to complete a task. And that's totally appropriate. But that's not the only way that we can increase productivity. Productivity can also be around the importance of a task. It can be around increasing the quality of prioritization so workers complete the highest value tasks. If we work on the highest value tasks more often and with more frequently and first, then we are also increasing productivity. We're increasing the impact of productivity, the impact of the outputs that we are creating. So that's a second way that we can talk about productivity. A third way, of course, we can talk about productivity is around a process. So remember my example of lots of tasks in a process. Now, it can be that we increase the productivity of particular tasks in that process, and maybe that whole process increases. But also, in a process, between each of those tasks, we have to jump from task to task. Now, sometimes there is particular friction between those tasks. If we can increase the alignment of work, not changing the tasks themselves, but the alignment of the tasks, that can also increase the productivity of the entire process. It's not changing the productivity of the tasks themselves, but it increases the productivity of the process. So it's a different way of thinking about productivity at a process, not just a task level. And then finally, the fourth way to think about productivity is around outcome and impact. And we'll talk about this in just a second, where productivity is the result of the employee or the team increasing their effectiveness and impact through technology. Now, another way to focus on this fourth point is to think about generative AI in these two terms. Productivity is generally classically defined as output divided by input. And this is correct. Now, usually when we talk about increasing productivity, usually the focus is on the input. Now, the input is usually understood to be time. It's not necessarily time, but it's often taken as time. And the focus is on how can we decrease the input? Because if we can decrease the input for the same output, then we've increased productivity. But sometimes with generative AI, we actually increase the input. So we increase the time or the cost of what it is to create a particular piece of work. This can also increase productivity. Of course, for it to increase productivity, the output also has to increase. So sometimes when we talk about productivity, we are actually talking about increasing productivity, but we're in doing so by increasing the time of the input, but that leads to outsize increases of the output. So the point here is that productivity isn't always about saving time. It's sometimes about increasing time, but also increasing the output at the same time.
Hi, I'm Mary Masalio, a Vice President Distinguished Analyst at Gartner. I've led several sessions at many Gartner conferences through the years, and if there's one thing I can say about them, it's that attending them is the best way to stay ahead of the competition. Each conference I've been to provides attendees with invaluable insights and ideas, and the content is always relevant and tailored to key issues being faced by leaders in every core business, be it finance, HR, sales, IT, supply chain, or marketing. Join me at a Gartner conference to learn about emerging trends and gain new perspectives that you won't be able to find anywhere else. Leave our conferences ready to contribute more at work, and most importantly, be equipped with the skills to turn new ideas into action. Visit Gartner.com/conferences or the link in the description of this podcast to learn more.
Let's go into the second section here. You are grappling with this questions, where to introduce generative AI to boost productivity. Where in our organizations can we do this to increase productivity? And generative AI has that potential to revolutionize productivity. But we've found that the benefits are not uniform across all workers. We began to see this trend about 18 months ago, where if you look at two individuals, we saw lots of examples where we have two individuals doing the same job, the same tasks, same roles, same technology, same tools, same generative AI. And one of those individuals, their productivity goes up. One of those individuals, their productivity actually goes down. And we saw this and we thought, this is peculiar. This is not what we expected. So what is happening here? And so we dove into it and we did the research. And we found that productivity gains are decided by two things. Now, before going any further, I'm assuming that we have a few things in place. We have a good use case, so an appropriate use case, because generative AI is not the tool to increase productivity in all cases. We have a good technology and we have good data. Now, sometimes CIOs will say to me, well, if I only had those three things, that's the nirvana. Like, I wish it was that good. But with generative AI, we are talking about changing the way that individuals, people, approach their work, sometimes in a very fundamental way. And so if we have a technology that changes the way people work in sometimes a very fundamental way, then surely it would be common sense that it's not just the technology that determines the productivity gains, but it's also the people. And what we found was that productivity gains are decided by two things. They're decided by the career experience of the individual. So the career experience, not experience with generative AI, and the complexity of the function that that individual is in the organization. Understanding how these two factors, and we're going to talk about them for the next few minutes, how these two factors relate is very, very important, because as we will see that if you don't understand how these relate before you select your use cases, then, well, quite simply, you're going to be wasting some of your, potentially quite a lot of your investment in generative AI, because it's not going to get you the results that you are looking for, or at best, you're going to have very mixed results. So how can we understand these two factors? Well, if we put these two factors on a matrix, we have experience of the worker along the bottom. So at the far left, we have an individual who is straight out of school or university or college or an apprenticeship. And on the far right, we have an individual with 25, 30, 40 years of career experience. It's a bit scary for myself that I'm already well on the right-hand side. And then we have the function complexity. So within your organization, there are lots of different functions, and these functions have different relative complexity. And we've written about this in our research, and there's different factors that go into the function complexity. But for example, call center agents, or call center as a function, is of a lower complexity than corporate finance. Doesn't mean that one is simpler than the other. It just means that it's less complex. And individuals typically, as they go through their career, they are at one horizontal level on this graph, and they move horizontally across. It's very unlikely that they move up and down, and they certainly don't move up and down during the course of the day. So we're looking at individuals' career trajectories here. Now, the question then is, where do we see the highest productivity gains? Do we see the highest productivity gains with the least experienced workers? Or do we see the highest experience gains with the least complex functions? That's kind of what we expected, at least in part. But when we did the research, we found that neither of those is correct. Where we found the highest productivity gains is for those who are low experience to no experience, and in low function complexity, they're going to see a very significant boost in productivity. Equally, those in high complexity functions and individuals of high experience, they're also going to see a high boost in productivity. So that's where we're seeing that zone of deep productivity or productivity increase.
Thanks for listening to this latest episode of ThinkCast. That was Gartner Senior Director Analyst Nate Suda. To learn more about this topic and to see the full webinar, follow the links in the notes. ThinkCast will be back wherever you listen to podcasts a week from today. In the meantime, please rate, review, subscribe, and share with a colleague so neither of you will miss it.
ThinkCast is a production of Gartner. This podcast may not be reproduced or distributed in any form without Gartner's permission. It consists of the opinions of Gartner's research organization, which should not be construed as statements of fact. Content provided by other speakers is expressly the views of the speaker and/or their organization. While the information contained in this podcast has been obtained from sources believed to be reliable, Gartner disclaims all warranties as to the accuracy, completeness, or adequacy of such information. Although Gartner research may address legal and financial issues, Gartner does not provide legal or investment advice, and its research should not be construed or used as such.